So Rachel, did you know that if you commit a crime, scientists can take your DNA and they can reconstruct your face using your DNA?
What?
This is a new technique called DNA phenotyping, similar to what they use to catch the Golden State Killer, but a little bit different. So, give you some background on DNA phenotyping. It is where they take a blood sample from someone and they're able to, or just a DNA sample, and they're able to reconstruct their physical profile by having certain markers that they're looking for from the sample.
Almost like a sketch artist, but without a witness.
Right. Yeah, basically. So this has recently come up from a publication from Mark Shriver's lab from Penn State University. So in this paper, they compiled a list of genetic mutations that cause facial deformations. And they used this list to start making an algorithm to predict people's faces based on their DNA. So once they had this list of genes that cause facial deformations, they then looked at genetic profiles from different people to see how well it could predict. And then they were able to scan their faces and combine that with their genetic information to make their algorithm more and more accurate.
That's really interesting. How many subjects did they have to go through to make an accurate algorithm?
Yeah.
And how accurate is the algorithm?
Yeah, I think they had to go through a lot of subjects. I mean, if you want anything to be statistically significant in science, you have to have a lot of people involved. I'm not exactly sure the number that they had, but I do know that their analysis, their algorithm that they came up with, they said it only accounts for 23% of the genetic variation in human faces. So that's only a quarter of the variation within us.
So how can they make a very accurate image from just 23%?
And that's the big question right now. There is a new company that's been around for 2 or 3 years now called Paragon Nanolabs. And Paragon Nanolabs is a company that's marketing DNA phenotyping as a way to catch criminals. And the concern with them is that they say that they're using the algorithm from Mark Shriver's lab, but they don't have any published research about the algorithm they're using. So it's almost like a black box. Sheriff's departments will give them DNA, and they come out with a profile where they have this predictive model of a human face and what that person likely looks like.
So people are actively using this novel technique in investigations?
Yeah, they have started doing this. So if you go to Paragon Nanolabs website, they have a whole testimonials of how this has helped people, how they've caught criminals using this. But my big question is, how can we really trust this data?
Yeah,
because
are people using this in court to convict people?
So that's one interesting with DNA phenotyping is information about DNA and about a physical profile constructed from DNA is not valid in court because the science is not yet well established. So this research is pretty recent, and this company seems to be taking advantage of it and taking advantage of people. And yes, they have found some people from using this physical profile, but I also think it can bias them.
Yeah, I mean, even if they're not using this technique, presenting it in court, if investigators are using this to try and determine suspects, it could bias the investigation, right?
Right, yeah. And I mean, it's pretty easy to predict race or predict hair color, but a lot of the different facial features, a lot of those can change based on your environment.
Right, they're not even taking into account aspects like if the person has a tattoo.
Yeah, there's no way they can look at that. And even different epigenetic factors on if they'll be bald or other things. There's not much they can look at for that.
Right. How do you do this DNA phenotyping from the top?
Yeah, so it's very similar to if you've submitted your DNA to 23andMe or Ancestry. So first, they get the DNA from someone, whether it be at a crime scene or getting a sample from someone, and they have to verify that the DNA is good quality. So before you sequence DNA, and if it's not at a certain quality, then you really can't use it and you're not going to get helpful information. So then they send it off to what's called a sequencing core, or basically a group of people that do genetic sequencing. And this is done on a machine that is able to read the base pairs of DNA, and it's pretty amazing. And this takes about 4 days, and they are not sequencing the whole genome of this person. They're doing what's called Snip sequencing, or the single nucleotide polymorphism sequencing, if you remember back from some of our other videos that we talked about. So they're just looking for individual base pairs that determine variation in humans, because humans are 99.99% the same.
Right.
And they're just looking at that 0.1%, and they look at that through these little tiny changes spread throughout the genome. And then what they do is they use a certain amount of DNA once they're able to purify it, and they put it on what's called a SNP chip. So the SNP chip is made by the Illumina sequencing company, and a SNP chip's basically just looking for a lot of those different SNPs on this little chip, and it has different SNPs. Like, I think they profile 850,000 SNPs, and there's 850,000 tiny little dots that the DNA will bind to. You obviously can't see it because it's very small, but that's why it's called a SNP chip. And they've been able to see that when they do this, they're able to get 98.9% accuracy. So the fact that their machine and their system will call the DNA correctly 98.9% of the time. So there's still a little bit of variation, but out of those 850,000 SNPs, you have a lot of SNPs that you can work with.
If they can determine the SNPs that accurately, why can't they determine how your face looks? Because I'm not bridging the gap of 98.1 with that 23% statistic.
Yeah, and that's the thing with research. We're always still learning new genes that contribute to how people look, and even hair color and skin tone. There's a lot of genes that are involved, and there's a lot of those like epigenetic factors. So factors that are above the genome and can be removed and taken away. So that's
so it's not just one SNP. Is the red hair SNP?
Yeah. Well, there actually is one for red hair.
Oh, well, that was a bad example.
But like eye color, there's several genes. And height, if you look at height, I think there's like hundreds of genes.
Right.
So this is a good snapshot, but we're always continuing to learn. And it's hard with these sort of SNP chips, because if you have a combination of certain SNPs, it will be one thing, but then a combination of maybe 2 of the SNPs that are the same, but another different one, you get something completely different. So there's a lot of variation in trying to like mix and match and see what actually happens. So, but once they do the sequencing, they run it through their algorithm, which is very complex. So in the science community, it's really important to publish your research.
Right.
Because if you don't publish your research, then people don't know what your conclusions are, if they're legit or not.
And other people can't replicate what you've done.
Yeah. In science, it's really important to be able to replicate each other's work, because if you can't do that, then it's like your conclusions are faulty. So for Paragon Nanolabs to be selling this technology to people and they haven't published anything is kind of a crime in science, at least.
It's sketchy.
Yeah, for sure.
So if you're taking someone's DNA and making this physical profile of them, that calls into question, what protections do we have from this? I mean, it's your private genetic information.
Yeah, I mean, and if you remember back to our Golden State Killer video, police just took a napkin that he had blown his nose on and did DNA testing on that. And it gets into what is public property and what is private property. So if you throw a tissue away in a park, someone could pick that up and potentially get your DNA from that. But if you're in private, unless people have a warrant, they can't go and do much searching. But at least with our genetic information, we are protected by the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, or GINA, and this protects us from insurance companies hiking up our insurance if they find out that we have a disease. The one thing it doesn't protect against is life insurance companies, who they can get access to your genetics and decide whether or not to cover you or how much to charge you for your life insurance, just based on if you have a SNP that causes you to be predisposed to breast cancer.
But are there no protections from, you think about the Fourth Amendment and unreasonable search and seizure.
Within the United States, it's not completely clear what can be done in this sort of case. It kind of varies on a case-by-case basis, and also different judges will give you different warrants for different things. So it's not clear what you can do, but this does kind of butt up against the Fourth Amendment of the search and seizure. But it's almost like if someone's left their DNA at a crime scene, they're able to then use that to try and help with the crime.
But when it comes to taking samples from a suspect, I imagine that's very different.
Yes, it is. There's some states will consider that taking a cheek swab is minimal invasion, and others consider it like that's not okay. So it really just depends state to state and the warrants you're able to get. So one other concern about using this DNA phenotyping technology is that you could bias the people who are looking for the criminal.
Right.
So kind of like in the past when they've used DNA evidence and thought someone was the criminal and convicted them, and then found years later they used the wrong DNA, or the DNA was just so similar to that of another person, which is pretty rare, but it has happened.
Right.
So DNA phenotyping definitely has potential in the long run. I just think it needs a lot more research done behind it, and especially if you're going to be a company selling this to people, marketing it to them, and making them think that you know all this stuff and you haven't really published your research. It's not a great mode of things, but scientists are always learning new things. Paragon Nanolabs has helped quite a few people find a criminal. And this technology is really interesting, fascinating. We just need some more research done, especially if a company is going to sell this to other people. They need to make it clear what their methods are and how they're using them, not just cite someone's paper and be like, oh, we're using some of these methods, but also some of our own.
Right.
So it'll be interesting in the next few years to see where this technology goes and to see if it will also be allowed at court, because that would kind of change the game of if you're able to use physical profiles from DNA in a court case.